Muslims and Islam have long been the focus of Western mainstream media. The narrative in which they are portrayed has always been a fluid one. However, as trends indicate, Muslims should be increasingly concerned with the way in which they are being portrayed in the mainstream media. My name is Murtaza Jaffer. I've been a producer at Ahlulbayt TV for the last 3 years. During my time here, much of my focus has been on productions that are socio-political in nature. On a weekly basis, I've produced an analysis of the news that affect the Muslim community. That means I have a constant eye on the media with a focus on the way in which Islam and Muslims are being portrayed. Over time, I have come to accept that Muslims are treated differently, whether that's Muslims here in the UK or abroad. I'm not alone in this train of thought. Many of my peers and colleagues also feel the same. In fact, in recent years, various independent studies have aimed to analyse both print and broadcast media, revealing trends that support this idea. One such example was carried out by Media Tenor, an international research institute led by Roland Schatz. His team looked at over 2.6 million news stories from mainstream outlets in America, Britain and Germany, and found that the media's coverage of Islam was rarely, if ever, positive. The vast majority depicted Islam, Muslims and Muslim organizations as a source of violence and a security risk, seldom dealing with the lives of ordinary Muslims. According to the study, in 2014, negative coverage of Islam reached an all-time high as ISIS gained a foothold in Iraq. Similar studies were also carried out focusing primarily on the UK press. One of the most prominent was carried out by Toney McCenery, professor in Corpus Linguistics at Lancaster University.
We were looking largely at newspaper material. We had a very large collection of, every newspaper story that mentioned Muslims or Islam in the period 1998 to 2010. Something like 146 million words we were studying. And in there we saw quite some negative attitudes. Now, we have to remember, of course, that the press have news values, and unfortunately, humans being what humans are, they like to read negative stories. So if we looked at almost any group in a newspaper, we'd find something negative. But there were some interesting features of how Muslims and Islam were talked about in the press that made us think that perhaps here we were seeing a lot of negativity.
I've come to meet Dr. Usama Hassan from the Quilliam Foundation. He's had plenty of experience with the media, having been published in newspapers like The Guardian, as well as appearing on the BBC and other media outlets. Many in the Muslim community label Quilliam as a government mouthpiece, who go out of their way to toe the line, so to speak. Maybe that's unfair, but in that vein, I thought it best to speak to Usama firsthand. Did he see things like the evidence suggests?
If we're talking about the mainstream media in Britain, for example, I think we have to say that there's the good, the bad and the ugly, if you like. There are very good journalists. In fact, British media, the newspapers, the television stations are some of the best in the world, actually. You only have to compare with parts of the Middle East or the United States even, and other places, and you see we get balanced reporting. Generally you have Ofcom, which enforces quite strict standards on reporting, for example, which you don't have in the United States, for example. And in my personal experience, I have to say, I would say about 90% of the interviews and experiences I've had are positive. I've had the occasional bad experience, of course, which you learn from. The odd trick question, or even the setup where they've basically, people have laid a trap for you, for example. Last year, or earlier this year, I was interviewed by a top BBC radio presenter who was very aggressive, asking about Islamic State as though they were totally based on Islam. I was actually very disappointed and quite angry at that interview, because he should have known better. He'd lived in the Middle East for a long time, and I thought that was appalling from a very senior and respected journalist within the BBC, for example. Another example would be the best-selling tabloid in this country is The Sun. And the Sun is famous for writing catchy headlines, and it's about selling newspapers. So unfortunately, sometimes, their headlines are very damaging, actually, front page coverage of, say, an ISIS atrocity, which links it to Islam.
There is no doubt whatsoever that 9/11 represents a major watershed in how Muslims and Islam are talked about in the UK press. No doubt whatsoever. Prior to that date, they're not mentioned very often, and when they are mentioned, it's actually usually in the context of the conflict that were occurring in the Balkans at that time, and Muslims actually in that case were largely viewed as the victims, as indeed they often were. With 9/11 and onwards, what we see is an enormous increase of mentions of Muslims in Islam in our data. We also see that different terrorist acts increase that trend, so over time the trend is escalating. Muslims in Islam are being mentioned more and more. And also, of course, when we look at the data, what we see is something like 50% of mentions of Muslims or Islam right to the present day are associated in some way with conflict, or they're in stories about conflict.
There are troubling aspects to some of the media coverage. For example, they use the term Islamic terrorism a lot, which is very misleading because it implies that Islam somehow justifies, terrorism or murder. You get headlines like Islamic terrorists or Islamic murderers, which is very offensive actually. Gordon Brown's government changed that. Gordon Brown used the term Al-Qaeda inspired terrorism to distinguish it completely from Islam, disassociate it completely from Islam. And there are parts of the media which tend towards the far right, which are slightly Islamophobic actually, and they use terms like Islamic terrorists on purpose, it seems to me very, very clearly, because they subscribe to that kind of notion of Islam, and we have to resist that. So yes, that's troubling.
Examples of mainstream media linking Islam and terrorism are found in almost all sections of the media. While Muslims have attempted to challenge this with varying degrees of success, their efforts were further pinned back when ISIS rebranded themselves as the Islamic State. Today, a search of news articles that use this term will bring forth nearly 12 million results. A number of these are published by the BBC. This of course entrenches the link between Islam and such terror groups. MP Rahman Chishti brought this up in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, I have now received a response from the BBC to my letter asking them to use the term Daesh rather than the so-called Islamic State. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, the response that I received is not worth the paper it's written on. They say using the word Daesh would breach their impartiality rules. I have to say it's the most bizarre logic I've seen. Considering we heard the response from the PM to me yesterday that he's happy for people to use Daesh, can we have an urgent debate on the floor of the House looking at the conduct and the behaviour of the BBC?
Many criticise the media's use of the term, as large swathes of the population now make that link even subconsciously, to the point it has become a political issue even in the upcoming US elections.
Radical Islamic terrorism. Now, to solve a problem, you have to be able to state what the problem is, or at least say the name. It's radical Islamic terror. And before you solve it, you have to say the name.
This issue is compounded even further when almost all media outlets, including the BBC, have failed to give a platform to Muslims that are more representative of the wider Muslim community. In July of 2016, radical preacher Anjem Choudary was convicted for hate speech and recruiting for ISIS, after which many Muslims criticized the mainstream media for having given him such a prominent platform in the first place. A search for Anjem Choudary will pull up nearly 30,000 articles. No other preacher or member of the Muslim community has been spoken about so regularly. In fact, last year the BBC came under fire when their Home Affairs editor compared him to Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. The same can be said for his TV appearances on all mainstream channels.
In the case of Anjem Choudary, yes, I think some parts of the media were very irresponsible and helped contribute to the problem. In fact, I wrote an article with an academic called Justin Guest around 2008 or 9, I think it was, in The Guardian, actually precisely pointing this out, saying, please don't give airtime to these uneducated, actually, people who are not really clerics because they've never gone through the traditional training. Some of the people, again, BBC and others described as clerics, had not done any of that. They were just basically loudmouths with an extreme viewpoint. And yes, that does sell papers. Certainly, it was irresponsible to give them so much coverage.
Having Anjem Choudary appear as a representative of the wider Muslim community has had wide-ranging consequences. Many unsuspecting viewers were given this false perception that only added to further suspicion and intolerance. unless this was actually an intended consequence on the part of the media. A similar point can be made when it comes to groups such as ISIS, who commit atrocities with the Western media in mind. It seems as if they know they'll get headline coverage every time.
In my opinion, the press and the terrorists are almost in a partnership. The terrorists know that the press will report violent acts, so they carry out violent acts. They carry out the types of violent acts that the press are likely to report, so these spectacular attacks, for example. And the press duly report them. So what we find in our data is every time that there is a spectacular violent act carried out by people who say that they're acting in the name of Islam, you find an enormous peak in reporting, and that peak doesn't go down to the same level as it before. So if you like, you get this plateauing effect where it's going up and up and up, and each violent, spectacular act carried out spurs the press on to talk about Muslims and Islam more.
There are various examples to prove this point. For instance, the ISIS banning of Jordanian pilot Mu'adh al-Qasasbi. A simple search of news in Google brings forth nearly 35,000 news stories. Similar searches can be done for other attacks, including the Belgian airport attack or the attacks on the offices of Charlie Hebdo, and the numbers of articles altogether is in the millions. By contrast, a search for a positive story, for example the amount of charity collected during Shahr Ramadan, and you get a lot less coverage. It does seem in some respect that both the terrorists and the mainstream media work hand in hand at the expense of regular Muslims who are then tarnished with the same brush. It begs the question as to why other Islamic organizations are hardly ever given a similar platform as ISIS and Anjem Choudary. For example, the Islamic Human Rights Commission, who have a consultancy status with the United Nations and have a long-standing policy of engaging in consultation with the government. They have also featured in mainstream media, but nowhere near as much as people like Anjem Choudary. Established in 1997, they have campaigned and advocated on behalf of Muslims both here and abroad. I've come to meet Arzu Merali, one of the founders of the organization. I want to know if what we're seeing in the media is actually translating into actual violations and infringements of Muslims' rights.
It's a really important question that you're asking, because a lot of the time people don't see a connection between the institutions of power, which includes the media, and actually what's happening on the ground to Muslims, whether they're being discriminated at work or being attacked, or as it happens, we have laws now that can differentially treat particularly Muslims. They can be treated on very light cases of suspicion and arrested compared to the rest of the population. And what you see when you are analysing those, the way those demonisations work and how they develop, you see running alongside that, and we've done a lot of survey work to ask Muslims about their experiences, you see a huge rise in the negative experiences they experience. So, for example, in 1999-2000, when we did survey work in the Muslim community in the UK, 35%, and the next year 45% said they'd experienced Islamophobia. In 2004, so 3 years after 9/11, we found that actually 80% of the sample said they'd experienced Islamophobia. That's a huge leap. Age, gender, nothing, class, ethnicity didn't make a difference anymore. And that's really been borne out. The most recent work we've done in 2010 and 2015 shows that every experience, whether it's seeing negativity on the television, whether it's being attacked on the streets, discriminated at school, all of these experiences have leapt up, sometimes doubled, and at the same time you analyse the media, you see there's less and less space for any kind of, not even positive story about a Muslim, but a balanced one, or about Islam or whatever. You really only see negative portrayals.
Can you give us examples of the Islamic Human Rights Commission that put pressure or opened a case on a media outlet?
There have been a few, actually, and this is not something we do so much of anymore. We used to do a lot of this. If there was a very negative portrayal, we would get people to phone up, or rather write to or email the television company that was involved, make complaints. Occasionally you'll get a clarification, particularly with the print media, and sometimes even an apology. There's been at least one case where we brought a libel case against a newspaper and they settled out of court and issued an apology. Other cases where they've had to retract and print apologies. But these days we don't focus so much on that, simply because now we think that really and truly, which is not to detract from anyone trying to do that, people should do that. We shouldn't feel afraid to do that. But the problem of media demonization, just the same as with political rhetoric and all of these things, need to be dealt with at a structural level. Really, there has to be some kind of intervention from the government. There has to be, work done at the top of media institutions. We cannot fix this as a community by just getting a correction here, there, or anywhere. It's much deeper than that. What it requires is a kind of bravery and leadership from our organisations. And I think that's where we're seriously lacking. I think we've unfortunately had a very kind of, sometimes very naive leadership that seems to think everything is hunky-dory and, they just have to be kind of swimming with the tide. Or again, we have leaders and organisations who are scared for all the same reasons as the grassroots. And again, I understand that. We all go through that. But ultimately, I think if the leadership and the organisations that say they're in leadership positions are not going to be brave, if they're not going to say the difficult things that need to be said to government and so on, for whether it's fear of prosecution, fear of losing their position or whatever, then actually we're not going to go anywhere, and if anything, we're going to go backwards.
I wanted to ask your opinion of, whether there's some kind of tacit approval from a government level. If you look at, for example, the mayoral campaign, and you see some of the statements that were made by the Prime Minister, such statements you wouldn't imagine about any other group or having been made, say, 10, 15 years ago. Is this the government is feeding the media, or has he, for example, fed off the media climate and he has found himself okay to say such things?
It's a bit of both, actually, and our argument and that of many theorists, we call it the domination-hate model of intercultural relations, is that the media, the political elites, and to a certain extent also legal institutions, education institutions, they all feed off of each other. And particularly the media and politicians, they kind of create that cycle of rhetoric. So, on any particular day, you don't know who started it, but they're all kind of complicit in it. And they feed off of each other. And yes, you're right, it's so kind of advanced that it just seems okay. They legitimize each other. There isn't a critical voice when it comes to this issue. And the failure of that, the idea is that the media should be the critical voice. And it's one of the institutions that holds the state to account, is completely non-existent when it comes to the issue of Islamophobia. And to be honest now, I think on many, many issues, I think Islamophobia just is the key one that kind of made the media very, very kind of docile.
The idea that the media is there to hold the government to account does come into question when it's the Prime Minister who chooses the head of the BBC. Of course, most media outlets are independent. However, Arzu raises a valid point when one cares to analyse the media narrative as a whole, particularly in light of data collected by Mr. McEnery. Further proof of this is the fact that many news outlets will even bring up a Muslim's faith when it has absolutely nothing to do with the story. One of the most prominent examples of this was when groups of men were being prosecuted for grooming young white British girls in the Midlands. News outlets were quick to reference the religious backgrounds of these individuals when there was no link between their faith and their crimes. Authorities were guilty of this also. The Guardian quoted a report by police and social services that also singled out the religious backgrounds of the offenders. In one of the latest cases, the group of offenders included 2 white British women. While the faith of the men was highlighted, there was no reference to the faith of the women.
When somebody's religious identity is brought into a news story, it really should be relevant. Almost everybody I've talked to from the press agrees with this point. The surprise, therefore, is that when we look in our data, we often see somebody's religious identity being highlighted when it has nothing to do with the story itself. So what we'd find very often in our data looking at the UK press was a link, say, between somebody being a Muslim and a benefits scrounger, fraudulently claiming benefits from the state. There is no way realistically that I can connect their religious identity with their actions in some ways to make it valid or relevant to the story, but nonetheless it happens.
After speaking to Arzu, I wanted a different perspective, someone from outside the community. I've come to meet Clive Menzies. He's one of the authors of a popular online blog called Critical Thinking. I wanted his take on the media and Muslims.
Media is probably the most powerful force of all because it determines political thinking, it determines what businesses do, it determines almost everything. You know, reputations are built and destroyed in the media overnight. I mean, if you look at the way Russell Brand was set up and then dropped, Jeremy Corbyn, well, Ed Miliband set up in the media and dropped. Jeremy Corbyn is currently being sort of pilloried in the media. So the media is if it doesn't feature daily, it features pretty frequently in our analysis because it's all about getting people to basically step away from the TV, turn it off, cancel your newspaper and go and look for yourself, because nothing you read or hear can be taken at face value. If you imagine that everything that's going on in the world fits in this room, then what we see in the media is sort of that much. And which bit they're showing us has an agenda behind it. They will only show us something that actually fits with what they want to achieve. They won't show us the bits that are inconvenient to their particular agenda. There's a schizophrenia in the media and in government and among politicians, because there's this sort of gratuitous sort of sympathy with Islam, ostensibly. You know, we mustn't demonize Muslims and, you know, we must treat them with respect and this, that and the other. And that is vocalized, if you like, directly. But subtly, there are all these references that undermine that narrative.
I've now come to meet Reza Nadeem from MPACUK. That's the Muslim Public Affairs Committee UK. They are very active when it comes to applying grassroots pressure on the media and the establishment. Reza often features on the BBC and on LBC radio when it comes to discussions regarding Muslims. I want to know just how successful they have been when it comes to applying this kind of pressure.
For example, Robert Kilroy Silk, he wrote an article in the Sunday Express saying that, you know, he called Arabs suicide bombers, limb amputators, women repressors, and that we owe the Arabs nothing, etc. And he said Muslims everywhere behave with equal savagery. And we campaigned with other Muslim groups, and we contacted the Commission for Racial Equality. He was forced off the BBC from his role. Another example was Will Cummins, a journalist, wrote for the Sunday Telegraph. He said, all Muslims, like all dogs, share certain characteristics. And the thing is now, ask yourself, would that be written about anyone else? The answer is clearly no, right? But MPAC UK, we campaigned again about this, and we wrote to the paper. We got Muslims to write in, to call in, and flooded them with phone calls, and you know, and even people tried to organise meetings with them, etc. And guess what? Surprise! After a 2-month campaign, he was finally sacked from his job. And again, it just works. I mean, I could go out, you know, even little things. The BBC referred to Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. One of this campaign was actually run by someone from the MPAC UK team who was just as in reading week at university, and all he did was he flagged up the story. They wrote an action alert. We put it out and on our database to all the Muslims that wanted to do something. And in the next 24 hours, the BBC had apologized. They had apologized, and also they said that actually that Jerusalem is not the capital of Israel. They just wrote Tel Aviv is the capital of Israel. So, you know, getting them to correct things that are factually incorrect. All this stuff has a role to play. One of the other media stories that we had was about the forced marriage story. A Muslim girl, Shafilia Ahmed, she was murdered by her parents, I think because they wanted to force her into a marriage. And it was covered as a Muslim thing, as if it's to do with Islam, that forced marriages is a part of our religion. And we flagged up to the BBC, we campaigned, and they changed that to say that it's actually not to do with Islam. And that has a role to play for, A, to show Muslims that this stuff works, but secondly, for the average non-Muslim who could be misled about what Islam stands for, what Muslims actually do in our society. Just changing that one word can have such an impact on a person's misconception or conception of your religion. If we as volunteers can monitor mainstream media outlets and what they're saying about Islam, if we as volunteers can write into them and campaign and meet with them, etc., can you imagine what we could do if we were much more organised? If our mosque took on our role, that they actually hired people to do what we do, Right? Can you just imagine the impact we can have? And that's it really. So a big part of our work now is saying, look guys, A, we're going to do campaigns to prove that it works, but B, we're going to actually equip you with the arguments and the tools that you need to do the same. So how to write a complaint, who to contact, and ipso, etc. What are the names of the editors of papers, etc. All that stuff. So we try to offer that as a service to the community because it's desperately needed, to be honest.
If you see something in the media that you object to, write to the newspaper or write to the TV channel in question and complain. Arm yourself with your rights. Find out about how you can complain if they don't take any notice of you. Write to your MP. There are lots of ways in a civil society of actually airing your grievances legitimately and getting real change in the long run. As I say, the Hillsborough families are probably the best example of that I can think of. And people should look at that and learn from that example. You can make a difference.
I have felt that over the last 5 to 10 years, I've definitely seen some articles and some things said you think, A, that wouldn't be said about any other community, but B, that wouldn't have been said before. But the climate has changed that now you can say things like this. And you know, I've been in debates on on BBC or other shows as well on different topics. And you sometimes look at the way that Islam is spoken about in such a disparaging way. Even like Ramadan. I mean, when I was growing up, Ramadan was never a discussion in mainstream media. It just wasn't. It wasn't like, oh, can you believe it, these children are going to have to fast? Can you believe it, they're going to be doing this, that, and the other? It just wasn't discussed. But now, every single year without fail, you have discussions about how Ramadan is happening, look at these poor children, etc. And it's a real, and I have seen a real, it was very intrusive. It's how can we critique every element of Islam? That didn't happen 10, 15 years ago. Now it's everything. Niqab, halal meat, mosques, madrasas, everything you can think of, everything.
MPAC's successes are not limited to pressurizing the media establishment. They have also campaigned against a number of different political figures also.
There was an Islamophobic councillor in Manchester who had accused a pro-Palestinian activist of being an ISIS supporter. And thanks to our campaigning, we got him actually suspended from the Labour Party. And this was very recent, actually, in October of 2015. So, you know, it's just, again, a part of it was to show Muslims that, look, if we can do this work, and we're primarily London-based, and we saw the story happening in Manchester, imagine you got more Muslims in Manchester doing the same thing, and Leeds, and Bradford, and Birmingham, etc., etc., etc. Can you imagine having a network of all these Muslims crisscrossed around the country dealing with any Islamophobic incident, Islamophobic story? We could have a massive impact. When it comes to general elections, we've actually been working for the last about 3-4 general elections now, trying to get Muslims to vote in a much more strategic way. I think for far too long our votes have been taken for granted, and MPAC said we want to change the game on that. We want to hold people to account on that. We want to make sure that we're represented at Parliament. We want to make sure our local, national and international concerns are represented by our MP. They work for you, not the other way around. And so we got working, trying to convince Moss, and that was quite difficult because some of them were very kind of embedded with the local parties. You know, they were councillors, or they had, they had their photo taken recently, so they were very pleased about that. So we had to deal with those issues, but you know, we tried to organise Muslims, show them how you can get politically active, how to make sure you design your leaflets and make sure that they fall within the rules on how we should campaign within British politics, and just make sure that we got our voices heard. And alhamdulillah, over years and elections, we've actually got rid of 4 or 5 different pro-war MPs across the country. So Andrew Dismore in Hendon, you had in Bradford East, you had the Labour MP as well at the time. And one of the biggest one was Lorna Fitzsimmons in Rochdale, which actually Channel 4 covered in a documentary called Operation Muslim Vote, where they actually kind of documented our elections at the time.
It's one thing to claim to have had an impact, but it seems members of the establishment are also taking notice of MPACUK.
So for example, the Mail on Sunday wrote an article about MPAC and they actually labelled us as an anti-Semitic organisation, as if it's a fact. And the reason is because we've been so pro-Palestinian and very open about, that we don't support Israel's occupation of Palestine. And we have received a barrage of hate from the establishment papers for that. And what's interesting is the average Joe says, well done MPAC, you're brave enough to say what needs saying. Whereas Muslim organizations, their mindset is, MPAC, you're stupid enough to say what needs saying. And that's what we've noticed the difference. That the average Joe, Muslim, yearns for Muslims to speak out more, especially the already established Muslim organizations and institutions, etc. But the Muslim groups, many of them, they self-censor so much that they actually don't speak about these issues. So for example, Israel-Palestine, right? Most Muslims you talk to, they'd be very clear on how they feel, which is Israel doesn't have a right to exist on Palestinian land. It's actually not that hard for someone to articulate that. But you will struggle to get some Muslim organizations to ever say that. And that duplicity really puts off a lot of Muslims, because they think, why are you acting like this? Say what needs saying. We know what we believe, right? People that are advocates for Israel, they will never shy away from justifying white phosphorus falling on children. But you can't even justify an end to occupation. And because you're worried that you won't be seen as a moderate, and you self-censor so much. So I mean, this Mail on Sunday article, we've written a response to them and contacted Ipsos because they've lied about us. And so, you know, in the next week or so, we'll have some responses in the coming weeks. But it's, but yeah, for me, an article by the Mail on Sunday on us, to me, proves that we're doing something right.
It's interesting that Reza mentions Ipsos. They are the Independent Press Standards Organization. I wonder how many Muslims are actually aware that such an organization exists. He has lobbied them and met them on a number of different occasions.
It was very interesting actually meeting Ipsos, because they were quite keen to meet us as well, because they're saying, oh, we don't get many Muslims actually coming to us. And that was a big thing for us. They're saying, oh, like, as a community, we've not actually made an effort to extend the hand to them and say, let's get talking about different issues, our concerns. And you could never say that about the other minority groups or special interest groups. They make sure that their causes are heard. But it was very interesting, that they were eager to meet us because they don't actually talk to Muslims that much anyway. So that was the first thing. But secondly, what was interesting is that if there's enough societal pressure, they will act on a story. So the Sun 1 in 5 story about, you know, the 1 in 5 Muslims support ISIS. Their process, they actually, from what I understand, they really sped it up, because they realized there was so much outrage on social media about the conduct of the Sun newspaper that they said, we have to do something, but also we have to be seen to be doing something. And that was fascinating, that pressure just would really impact on how quickly they worked on a story.
The 1 in 5 story published by The Sun caught many people by surprise. Such an inflammatory headline based on a poll taken completely out of context. The poll asked 1,000 Muslims how they felt about young Muslims who leave the UK to join fighters in Syria. 4% of respondents said they had sympathy, and 15% said they had some sympathy. The Sun took this data and said 1 in 5 Muslims sympathized with the terrorist group ISIS. No differentiation was made between the different groups and nuances on the ground. The Times ran the same story as well. Muslims up and down the country were incensed and took to social media to make their protests heard. Many groups, including MPACUK, contacted Ipsos. MEND were at the forefront of the complaints, and both papers begrudgingly published corrections retracting their accusations against everyday Muslims.
This stuff actually works. All it takes is for you to have a focused goal and then take an organized, intelligent approach towards it, and you will get success. But you have to see it through. And I think that's where often we've fallen down, that we don't see through some of these. So when you see an Islamophobic story, we're very good at complaining to one another. But actually what needs to happen is we see it through and go through the complaints procedure, lobby them, meet the editor, etc., call them up, do what we need to make sure our voices are heard, so we won't tolerate being treated as second-class citizens. And guess what? You can have an impact. We've proven it. So now we just need more people to do it. And I genuinely believe it will actually change the face of reporting in this country if we all did our bit. But I think right now it's most of the work is done by few Muslims, and that means that we don't have the impact that we should have.
Reza is clearly very passionate and spends much of his free time trying to combat media bias and Islamophobia. The frustrations he has against the establishment is all too clear. However, he also makes a very valid point when it comes to the Muslim community. I know for sure I haven't done my part when it comes to the many disparaging articles I've read in the mainstream media. Like he said, if we all channeled our frustrations correctly, then things would change. In the meantime, I've come to meet Haseeb Rizvi, director at Muslim Vibe, an online magazine that has quickly become one of the most popular online resources for Muslims, with articles touching on current affairs, social issues, family life, faith and spirituality. I want to know whether the success of Muslim Vibe is in any way linked to the Islamophobic nature of mainstream media. Are Muslims gravitating to such websites because they feel increasingly alienated by mainstream media?
So what we've seen in the last 5 years or so, the last decade even, with the rise of Facebook and Twitter and so on and so forth, is that the shift of people's attention has moved away from mainstream media and has gone towards alternative media. People are now tired of what they see on TV or what they read in the traditional newspapers on print. They want to get the other perspective. And what the internet has allowed us to do is communicate with people that are miles away from us, but in a very small amount of time. And if we're clever about it, and this is where the Muslim community really lags behind sometimes, if we truly capture the importance of the internet as an asset for us to proclaim our religion, defend ourselves, whatever it may be, the possibilities are potentially endless.
Have the Muslim Vibe written any articles off the back of, maybe some media coverage where the article is now specifically looking at the media, discussing how the media acted or reacted to a specific story?
There was an incident not so long ago regarding Orlando shooting in Florida. After the shooting incident, it was very quickly established that, this was an Islamic terrorist attack on a gay nightclub, which then turned out several weeks later to be revenge on a former partner of his. And there was really no link to Islamic extremism, so on and so forth. But in that first 2 weeks of this news incident, every day, every single mainstream media news outlet reported it as being Islamically linked. But sadly, in the story, what ended up happening is an unsuspecting Shia cleric was made the scapegoat of this incident. So what the mainstream media found easy to do was basically take a clip from a academic talk that was being given regarding Islamic perspective on homosexuality, and then that scholar ended up having to get deported from Australia, so on and so forth, and it became a very big mess. And unfortunately, what we didn't see was any reply from other Muslim organizations in defense of that scholar. So the Muslim Vibe took it upon themselves to share and defend his perspective, get his word out there. We shared it with other non-Muslims. And one of the things that we do on the Muslim Vibe is whenever we post things out on Facebook, we will always promote it as well. So it will come up as a sponsored advert. So we targeted that to non-Muslims to show this scholar was wrongly accused of wrongly linked to this incident.
With regard to social media, we find a very different pattern of reporting when we look at words like Muslim and Islam. We've just completed a piece of work which looks at all mentions of Muslim and Islam on Twitter from 2010 to the present, funded by the UK ESRC, a UK research council funded by the taxpayer, and a Muslim NGO called MEND. What you find in there, of course, are two crucial differences. Firstly, Muslims have their own voice. They can broadcast on this medium, so you find them talking about Muslims and Islam. And also the news values on Twitter are different. When you look at the word Muslim, for example, on Twitter, the phrase in which it's most often used is Happy Muslim New Year. That's a phrase you never find in the UK press, but it's the most frequent phrase associated with Muslim on Twitter.
While the internet and social media has provided a space for Muslims to create their own media, you find a lot of hate and Islamophobia coming through online and on social media. What's more, almost all mainstream news websites will have a space for users to interact and comment on the many articles that are already biased against the Muslims. These comment sections become breeding grounds for people to espouse their hate. While efforts are made to moderate comments, there is little hope when the actual article is already biased.
I guess the whole, aspect of being behind a screen allows people to vent or say things that they wouldn't normally say. Now, obviously, when there is hate coming through that is, threatening you with violence, so on and so forth like that, there are calls to, report it to the police. And of course, one should do that as much as possible. But there is still a large element of our people that are engaged in debates that are essentially going to go nowhere. So we're wasting a lot of time and energy, I feel, commenting on Facebook and replying on Twitter to every troll that comes along. And where the Muslim community individually, like individual people like yourself and I, should be focusing on is how much they're doing to positively outweigh negative voices, if that makes sense, as opposed to responding to them. So create a whole new section of content, let's say on the internet, which is positively promoting Islam, as opposed to getting involved in some abyss that's really gonna never change anything.
Haseeb's approach is quite unique, and I think he's onto something. While there is a need to challenge the hate and media bias on one hand, are we focusing enough efforts on changing perceptions through our own media, spreading a positive message that's actually helping people? Are we sharing enough positivity to combat negative perceptions on the front foot, as opposed to reacting to those who have an agenda of hate and discrimination? This kind of approach is not limited to the media. Even in our own day-to-day lives, is our behavior and character an asset to Islam, Muslims, and the wider society? Or are we a burden on the state, falling into the stereotypes set by the media? All in all, it's interesting to have met Mr. McEnery and study his findings, even if they do leave you quite concerned at the image of Muslims portrayed by the mainstream. We can't ignore these findings. Muslims are being demonized. What are we going to do about it?